The insurance industry has run the numbers on American hail and reached a conclusion it does not usually put in writing. A single hailstorm causing $30 billion in damage is considered likely within decades. Not a hurricane, not an earthquake. Ice. In Texas alone, there are 9 million properties sitting in the hail risk zone with a combined reconstruction value of $1 trillion, and more than 235,000 Texas homes were struck by damaging hail in a single year. Across the country in 2025, stones 2 inches or bigger hit at least 600,000 houses, and damaging hail fell on 142 separate days, well above the 20-year average of 122. This is the disaster that lands on ordinary driveways and ordinary roofs. And the reason America gets the worst of it on Earth comes down to one collision of air happening east of the Rocky Mountains. What an 8-inch hailstone did in South Dakota, and the evening a Texas family festival was caught in the open with no roof to run to, is where this goes. But first, how a piece of ice gets big enough to be a catastrophe. Hail starts as rain. Inside a thunderstorm, an updraft, a column of rising air, carries raindrops upward into air far below freezing. Up there, supercooled water droplets freeze onto whatever they touch, and a small pellet of ice begins gathering layers as it circulates through the storm. It only falls when it becomes too heavy for the updraft to hold. That is the entire mechanism, and it contains the whole story. The size of the stone is a direct measure of the strength of the wind that was holding it up, which is why the most destructive hail comes from one specific kind of storm. A supercell is a thunderstorm with a rotating, sustained updraft, the most powerful and longest-lived updraft any storm on Earth produces. Ordinary thunderstorms build, dump their rain, and collapse. A supercell can keep its updraft running for hours, recycling hailstones through the freezing layer again and again, adding shell after shell of ice. A stone the size of a golf ball needs an updraft most storms never achieve. A stone the size of a softball needs one that is close to the physical limit of what the atmosphere can do, and America builds those storms better than anywhere else because of a geographic accident that has no equal on the planet. Along the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, cold air spilling off the high terrain meets warm, wet air pulled north off the Gulf, and strong wind shear stacks those layers so they slide over one another instead of mixing. That is the exact recipe for supercells. The region it happens in has a name, Hail Alley, centered on Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma, and reaching into Texas and South Dakota. No other country on Earth has that combination of a north-south mountain wall and a warm ocean feeding moisture straight into it. The shape of a hailstone carries the record of that journey, and it is one of the few places in weather where the evidence survives long enough to hold. Cut a large stone in half and it shows rings, like a tree, alternating bands of clear and cloudy ice. Cloudy layers form when the stone grows fast in colder air and traps tiny air bubbles. Clear layers form when it grows slowly through a wet skin of water that freezes smoothly. Each pair of bands is another trip up and down inside the storm. A softball-sized stone is not one event. It is dozens of laps through a machine that kept throwing it back up. That also explains the damage pattern that surprises people the first time they see it. Hail rarely falls straight down. It arrives with the storm's wind behind it, driven sideways at highway speed, which is why the destruction concentrates on one face of a house, the windward siding, the west-facing windows, the exposed side of every parked car on a street, while the sheltered side comes through untouched. Whole neighborhoods end up with damage on exactly the same wall. The result is a bill that arrives every single year. NOAA puts the average damage from hail to American property and crops at roughly $1 billion annually. That is the baseline, the cost of a normal year before anything unusual happens. Then there are the years that are not normal. On the 8th of May 2017, a hailstorm crossed the Colorado Front Range and caused about $3 billion in insured losses. To this day, it remains the costliest catastrophe in the history of the state of Colorado. Not a wildfire, not a blizzard, not a flood. Hail. Then, on the 30th of May 2024, the Denver metro area was hit again, and that storm alone caused more than $2 billion in damage. 2 separate multi-billion-dollar ice events in one state inside 7 years. And the reason insurers now talk about a $30 billion event is not that they expect the hail itself to get 30 times worse. It is that the target has grown. Hail Alley runs directly through some of the fastest expanding metropolitan areas in the United States, the Front Range Corridor, the Dallas-Fort Worth sprawl, the suburbs of Oklahoma City and Kansas City. Every year there are more roofs, more vehicles, more solar panels, and more warehouses parked underneath the same storm track. A supercell that would have crossed empty ranch land in 1970 now crosses 100,000 homes. The number that grew is not the hailstone. It is what stands underneath it. Which brings this to the evening that shows what happens when large hail finds people rather than property. On the 5th of May, 1995, thousands of people were at Mayfest, a family festival in Trinity Park in Fort Worth, Texas. At about 7:15 in the evening, baseball-sized hail came down on an open-air crowd with almost no shelter to reach. 60 people were injured at the festival alone. Across North Texas, more than 400 people were hurt that night. 16 people died. And here the record needs to be stated exactly, because it is often repeated wrongly. Those 16 deaths came from the flooding that accompanied the storm, not from the hail. The hail did the injuring, the water did the killing. In today's money, the damage came to roughly $2 billion, and at the time, it stood as the second most damaging storm in Texas history. There is a reason a crowd was caught that way, and it is still true today. Hail gives almost no useful warning at the individual level. A tornado warning tells people to get to a basement, and the threat is a narrow path. A hurricane gives days. A large hail warning covers a broad area, arrives minutes ahead, and the instruction is simply to get under a roof, which works perfectly for anyone already indoors, and not at all for a park full of families, a stadium, a parking lot, a highway, or a fairground. The hazard is trivially survivable if a person is inside a building, and genuinely dangerous if they are not, and the difference between those two states is often about 90 seconds of notice. That is what makes hail such a strange hazard in the American risk picture. It very rarely kills. It maims cars, shreds roofs, destroys crops, blows out windows, and sends people to emergency rooms. And it does so across enormous areas at once, on a scale that quietly rivals the disasters that get named and remembered. The upper limit of what can fall from an American sky was measured on the 23rd of July 2010, near the small town of Vivian, South Dakota. National Weather Service meteorologists from Aberdeen examined a single hailstone recovered there and recorded it at 8 inches across and 1.94 pounds. Both United States records, and both still standing. 8 inches is roughly the size of a volleyball. Nearly 2 pounds of solid ice, falling from the base of a storm at highway speed. The updraft required to hold an object like that in the air is difficult even to picture. There is one more reason the exposure keeps climbing, and it has nothing to do with the weather. What sits on a modern American roof is worth far more than what sat on one a generation ago. Rooftop solar arrays, satellite and antenna equipment, skylights, and rows of air conditioning and ventilation units on the flat roofs of warehouses and shopping centers. All of it is fragile, all of it is expensive, and all of it faces straight up. The same is true at ground level. A parking lot of modern vehicles carries sensors, cameras, and glass that turn a dented panel into a far larger repair bill than it once was. Even where the storms have not changed at all, the cost of the same hail falling on the same acre keeps rising every year. None of this is history that stopped. On the 28th of April 2026, a hailstorm crossed the Springfield metropolitan area in Missouri with stones from baseball size, 2 3/4 inches, up to 4 3/4 inches across. Thousands of vehicles and homes were damaged, along with businesses, vegetation, and utility infrastructure. Numerous people were treated in area hospitals. At Dickerson Park Zoo, an emu was killed by the hail and another animal was left in veterinary care. 2 months later, on the 24th of June, hail up to 4 inches, officially described as softball-sized, fell along the Colorado Front Range and out onto the eastern plains, breaking windows and causing significant damage in communities including Wiggins and Sterling. The trend line underneath those events is the part that matters most. In 2025, damaging hail fell on 142 days in the United States, against a 20-year average of 122. Stones of 2 inches or more struck at least 600,000 homes in that 1 year. In Texas, more than 235,000 residences took damaging hail, in a state that averages around 164 hail events annually and roughly $338 million in property damage. Colorado, the second hardest hit, absorbs less than half of the Texas figure, and Colorado is where the costliest catastrophe in its own history was a hailstorm. Those numbers land somewhere very specific: household budgets. Hail is the damage line ordinary Americans are most likely to have actually claimed on, and after a big event, the effects spread outward for years. Roofers arrive in convoys. Claims flood in across an entire metro at once, so adjusters and materials run short and repairs stretch through the following winter. Insurers reprice the whole region afterwards, and deductibles for wind and hail are often set as a percentage of the home's insured value rather than a flat sum, which means the homeowner's share of a roof replacement can run into thousands. In the worst-hit corridors, carriers have narrowed coverage or pulled back entirely. A single afternoon of ice quietly rewrites the cost of living on a street for a decade. The peak of the American hail season runs from April through June, when the temperature contrast between the Rockies and the Gulf is at its sharpest and supercells form most readily. That is a narrow window in which a very large share of a whole country's annual property damage gets delivered, mostly by ice, mostly across the same handful of states, mostly onto homeowners who find out about it by walking outside the next morning and looking up at a roof. So the $30 billion storm the industry describes is not a prediction of a specific season, and nobody is saying it arrives this year. It is a statement about arithmetic. Put the strongest updrafts on Earth over the fastest growing suburbs in America, run that experiment every spring, and eventually the storm and the city line up. 7.9 million Texas properties are already inside the zone. Subscribe for the real numbers on the next one, verified and in full.